Okay, welcome to Ubiquity. In this podcast, we're going to be exploring topics at the intersection of technology, business, society, and philosophy. We're going to take multiple lenses to these topics. We're just two guys who are really interested in all of these topics, and we want to just kind of raise some questions. We won't have answers for everything, but we do like to talk about it, and we do like to kind of put some thought around and some structure around these things. So my name's Eugene Choi. I'm a management consultant. I have an MBA from the Rotman School of Management, and I took philosophy, ethics, society, and law in my undergrad.
Hi, I'm Shyam Sridhar. I'm a technologist by profession. I also have an MBA from the Rotman School of Management, and I have a bachelor's in computer science engineering.
Great. So our first week, we're actually going to be talking about big data, privacy, and ethics. So I hope you enjoy this episode. So we're here to talk about big data. Let's just go straight into the introduction of big data. Let's define it so that we know what we're talking about and give a couple of examples of companies actually utilizing big data.
So what is big data? Big data is anything, it's basically a large amount of data in petabyte or exabyte scale, right? The kind of data can be anything. It can be in table, it can be images, text, whatever it is, right? It's just a massive amount of data.
Why is it specifically like petabyte scale, exabyte scale data?
Typically, if the data size is much more smaller, then the amount of the analysis you can make on that smaller data size is not very meaningful, right? When you are looking at a large scale of data and when you are running all kinds of statistical analysis on it, your predictions are much more accurate, and that's why this big data is so much popular. We are looking at implementations of big data everywhere. For example, if you're watching Netflix, you have been watching for so many years, and some of the recommendations it gives are pretty accurate, unless no one goes into your profile and watches a kid show or a different show, and it totally screws up its models. Most of the time, it's pretty accurate, right? Or if you're thinking about Amazon, and when you're looking at a product, or if you're even on the homepage, some of the recommendations it gives are pretty spot on. And these are all used on a variety of data sets, from your clicks, from your browsing history, how much time you spend on a single page, where you're hovering, everything is tracked. And it's basically these companies are making a profile of you, and they're trying to figure out what you like, what are the things that you're more likely to buy, and they are trying to sell those items to you, right? So big data is being used pretty much everywhere these days.
So it sounds like if all of these companies are collecting so much data from us, then there might be concerns around privacy, right? Privacy risk.
Sure. So let me turn this around. What is privacy, and why is it important?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it goes really to the heart of Western society, right? If you think about a liberal democracy like most Western countries are, the idea of individual rights is extremely important. So the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of religion. The only way that we can maintain these rights is if there are no big entities, and historically these were government entities. But I think as we explore later, some of these big companies will become kind of quasi-governmental entities. So historically, if you have any big entities that are collecting data about you, collecting information about you, that threatens your ability to have freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, because you could be persecuted for your thoughts and for your speech. So we're seeing that even play out a little bit now, where people are being persecuted for some of their expressions online, right? Now there's questions there in terms of if you voluntarily give data, if you voluntarily say things out loud and say it on a platform where you'll be sharing it with millions of people, then do you really have a claim to privacy for that? That's probably no. The answer to that is probably no. But if you're inferring my position on things based on the data that I provide, that's not directly related to me expressing a position, that might be problematic. So let's say, for example, on Amazon, if I tend to buy certain books or I tend to buy certain products, and that those products are correlated with the buying patterns of people who support leftist parties versus right parties, then you're inferring my political position, you're inferring my thoughts based on patterns of data that I'm not actively consenting to give you, right? So the threat is a fundamental threat to individual rights that liberal democracies are founded on. And that's why it's important to understand how privacy is considered and how privacy is protected.
Actually, that makes me think of an interesting story if you heard about the Target thing, right?
What's the Target thing?
Well, I think it was in the 2013s or 2014s. Target started sending to this teenage girl advertisements about baby products, cribs, diapers, all kinds of stuff.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So her dad saw that and he was like super mad. Like he went to the press. There was a big story around it. And Target actually apologized. But here's the thing. So after a while, they found out that this teenage girl was actually pregnant. And the interesting thing is Target knew about this before her family knew about it. So first of all, where do we go from a privacy standpoint? And there's a whole ethical dilemma here. Like, so where do we go from there for situations like this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of interesting questions there. First of all is, she was probably a minor, right? And whether or not she had the ability to actually consent to her data being used in a certain way is an interesting conversation to have. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that let's just ignore the issue that she's a minor. The ethical issue for me here is, the way that I'm thinking about it is the communications were actually meant for her and not for her dad, right?
Sure.
So if I'm giving you information based on a voluntary relationship that you've had a part in creating that relationship, then I don't really think that there is an issue there. The privacy breach seems to be the fact that her dad got a hold of that, rather than Target using that for any nefarious purposes or any malicious purposes, which really should be, I think, the responsibility of the person receiving that communications back, right?
Sure.
But I guess there is another question that I have in my mind as I think about this. It's in these large companies, we tend to think about these large companies as entities in themselves, right? They're independent entities. Facebook is trying to do this. Target is trying to do this. But the reality is, as you know, both of us have worked in IT teams before. It's not it's not a company doing something. It's really the people in the teams that are creating these features. So you have roles like product managers who are coming up with features collaboratively with let's just assume that there's a pod of people, with their engineers, with their designers. These are individual people who are playing roles within the firm, who are deciding what kind of features to put in. So if there's a feature that misuses data that's infers information that otherwise the user would not want you to infer, that's actually a conscious decision made by people within teams. So what are the considerations of the people within the team, and should they be kind of morally responsible for some of their actions.
But how can you say it's a conscious decision? Like these guys, I'm assuming now they're developers, they're product managers. They are building what they're asked to build. So they might not know what's the impact of building such a product, right? Like to a technologist, like you are creating this machine that can show people what they want to buy. So from someone who's building that, it looks like amazing. From an engineering standpoint, that's all they're looking at. They're not looking at, oh, this can be the next Skynet and take over the world, right?
Right. It could be. So I guess that's the question then. The question is, should there be some education around this, or should there be some knowledge that's shared that will help these technologists think about the societal impact of their creations? Because, like I said, these companies are not independent entities. They simply exist on paper. They're legal entities. What makes the products real are the people who are developing them. And if the people who are developing them don't have an understanding of how to think about societal impacts, then is that an issue?
Maybe they should have a philosophy COE, so they have all this.
So they've got agile COEs, philosophy COEs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe we should pitch that to one of these FANG companies. That's our next business idea. Let's do it.
Sure. So the other big thing that is kind of interesting and troubling in some ways about big data is about using the predictive capabilities of data in policing, like predictive policing. So right now it is pretty safe to infer that law enforcement is using locational data, social media to pretty much accurately pinpoint regions or pockets of areas within a city, within a municipality, or where there are crimes likely to happen, so they can deploy more resources to prevent those crimes. That is great, right? Like so this is amazing. So we know that law enforcements are pretty much thinned out across Canada, US, most countries, right? So they are able to deploy resources more efficiently.
Can I just jump in there?
Sure.
What if the placement of those devices is based on biased thought in the first place? So let's say, for example, we know this to be true. We know that communities that have a greater proportion of Black people, they tend to have more police surveillance. So the increase in criminal rates from Black communities versus other communities may not necessarily be due to the fact that there's more criminal activity happening. In fact, it's usually more police, so that's more visible. So then there's more enforcement of the crimes or reporting of the crimes, right? So then when you think about the data or the devices that are installed, you're not going to install devices everywhere, right, to get data. You're going to install them in high risk areas, which already is informed by biased thinking.
Sure, I agree. But the premise, at least the assumption that I'm making is like you're designing the system that kind of eliminates all these biases as much as possible, right? Like you shouldn't put more surveillance where you know there's always high crime. That's an obvious thing. That defeats the purpose. You're putting all these devices and surveillance across the board so that you get a very decent sample size and you're able to pinpoint those pockets.
Okay, so let's assume that the police will actually be deploying these in a neutral way, let's say. Okay, go on. Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
No, that's fine. No, that's a good question, right? Look, so that's the assumption. So if we stick to these assumptions and the benefits that we are getting out of it is good. But now let's take a step further. Like, what if they're able to instead of a location level, they're able to predict it to an individual level. Now we are talking like Minority Report stuff.
Yeah.
Now, where does it go, right? Like now it gets a little bit complicated. Like you are going to be charging someone of a crime they haven't yet done.
And we're assuming here that they're using big data similar to, let's say Amazon uses big data, right? Amazon is predicting what we'll buy, but we're assuming they're going to use data law enforcement is going to use data to predict what crimes you'll commit.
Yeah.
Right. And this incidentally is probably not science fiction, because we've read from multiple sources, Economist, NPR, that China is already instituting systems that track people and track their quote unquote social credit. So they're not using this for criminal purposes yet, but they're using facial surveillance, right, to facial recognition, and tracking their behaviors and tracking their pattern of like whether or not they actually pay their debts.
Oh,
yeah. So they're cross-referencing whether people pay their debts, what behaviors they exhibit while they're being surveilled.
damn. Yeah.
And then they're assigning a social credit score to people, and the social credit score impacts things like your ability to buy train tickets, your plane tickets. So maybe your first couple of violations, you will no longer be able to take the high-speed rail. You might have to take like the local rail or the slow-mo rail. But in future, if you have a few more violations, you might not be able to leave the country.
It sounds like that Black Mirror episode.
I didn't watch that.
Okay, there's a Black Mirror episode where everything is based on this credit-based system, right? Or ratings-based system. So if you're like, you get certain services if you're 4 and above, and you don't get those services if you're 3 and below. Like it's just crazy. Like this is what.
So my Uber score would determine like whether or not I can eat at a certain restaurant or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you can live in this condo or not. Probably.
Yeah. So I mean, we know that this is happening, and in certain parts of the world, and I guess the question is, when it comes to police using data to predict what behaviors you will engage in, if they can predict it to a very high confidence level, then can you think of yourself as still having free will?
Regardless of what high the confidence level, it's not certainty. Like 99% is not 100%.
Right.
So even at the last microsecond or nanosecond, I can choose not to do that thing. So is it really fair?
I mean, if we go to the basics, right, moral responsibility, so responsibility for actions requires some kind of free will, so that you have freely engaged in that kind of behavior. Free will? So free will is this idea that the main cause of your actions is yourself and not any external factors. Now, this Minority Report thing gets it bends the model a little bit because it's predicting that you will commit a certain behavior. But moral responsibility, one of the premises is that you actually have committed something, right? Now it's the prediction that you very likely will commit that if I don't stop you, right? Is that where we're getting at?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going to close my eyes and pretend that there's no difference between the two, and we can think about like kind of what this means for kind of how we think about moral responsibility and free will. So traditional philosophical thought kind of breaks down into two schools of thought mainly. One is called compatibilism and the other is incompatibilism. And this has to do with, well, compatible with what, right? Compatible is with the idea of determinism. So determinism is whether or not prior states of the world accurately predict future states of the world. So if you know everything about, let's imagine that you have a billiards table in front of you, right? You know all the places of all the billiards balls, right? and you know the cue stick coming down, right? Someone's holding a cue stick and it's coming down at a certain velocity, in a certain angle, at a certain location, right? About to hit a certain ball. If you know all of that information, you should be able to accurately predict 5 seconds from now where every single ball within that billiards table is, because you know the coefficient of friction, you know like all the force that it requires to move a ball, and all of these other factors. So that's determinism. And there's disagreement about whether the world we live in is a deterministic world or is not a deterministic world, right?
Okay.
So the way that we tend to think about physics and the I'm going to say hard sciences is that the world is deterministic, right? Because you think about the interactions of
Cause and effect.
Yeah, cause and effect, but the molecules and the atoms and whatever, like there's certain physical rules that happen, and then they inevitably cause some effects to happen down the road, and then that effect will then in turn cascade, right? It becomes the cause for other effects. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the hard sciences, quantum theory being a little bit of an exception, the hard sciences tends to think of the world as deterministic. So if the world is deterministic, then can you have free will?
Ooh.
Here's where the two schools of thought again break down, right? If compatibilists will argue that yes, the world is deterministic, and yes, you still have free will. And incompatibilists will say the world cannot be deterministic because we have free will. Or if the world is deterministic, then we can't have free will, right? So what would you think initially?
I don't know, man. Like, I think certain things are deterministic, but there's so much happening that cannot be explained by science, right? So I would assume there's a good mix of both deterministic and non-deterministic stuff happening. So I would assume that you should have free will.
So the idea of determinism versus indeterminism is a binary one. So either it's completely deterministic, or there are at least some things that are not deterministic.
So it is not deterministic.
Right. That's your initial thought?
Yeah.
Well, some philosophers have argued that free will is compatible with determinism. That despite the fact that this world is a deterministic world, we actually do have free will because of this principle called the principle of alternative possibilities, right? That you could always have done otherwise. So let's say my upbringing causes me, right? My history causes me to hit the big red button that shoots a nuclear missile. Sorry for being too graphic, but you know, there's parts of my history that causes me to push the big red button. That nevertheless, I still had free will and I still exercised free will in pressing that button because I could always have not done that.
Yeah.
There's the alternate possibility that I didn't consider.
Or if there was a multiverse.
Sure. Sure, that works too. Now, I actually think that there's a problem for free will, whether or not determinism is true. So hear me out here. I think my instinct is like yours. I am more an incompatibilist. So if this world is deterministic, then I don't think that we can have free will, because free will has to be meaningful, right? Again, if we go back to the fact that moral responsibility requires free will, right, then we need to be saying something when we say that we have free will. If everything that I do is predetermined, then the assignment of moral responsibility is meaningless because my actions are already determined. So why bother assigning responsibility if my actions are already determined, right? So I think it's meaningless to talk about free will in a deterministic world. Now, the problem with indeterminism is, let's say, for example, that quantum quantum mechanics, right? We know there's strong evidence for quantum mechanics. Let's say that, for example, there could be random events that happen in your brain that trigger certain neurological responses that cause you to do a certain action, right? And in quantum mechanics, you can have quarks or electrons or whatever popping in and out of existence, right? And that could trigger some kind of neurological reaction. Now, the problem with indeterminism for me is that that's also not up to you. It's random. So you don't have free will. It's just that your actions are random.
Sure. Okay.
Right? So I think the approach that classical philosophy or traditional philosophy has taken to these issues is kind of they're thinking way too deep into the theory of it's linking it to too many different factors. What we can say is it practical to assign moral responsibility to agents who act? Yes, it's practical because we want to hold people accountable for their actions. Do we feel like we have free will? Yes, I feel like we do.
Yeah. Agree.
I think that's it. I think that's the answer.
Okay. So
yeah.
So if that's the answer, then this minority report thing, it's not right.
Yeah, I think so. Because up until the moment that let's say I have a gun pointed to your head, Sham, and I'm about to pull it, and then the police come and arrest me for attempted murder, I actually haven't attempted anything.
So there's crime or no crime. There's no pre-crime.
There's no pre-crime. Yeah, I think moral responsibility again is premised on the fact that some action has to have taken place before you can assign moral responsibility. You can't assign moral responsibility before there's an action that takes place.
Interesting.
Okay, so another question that kind of pops into my mind about big data and our sense of ethics, our sense of justice, our sense of fairness is this. So it's related to insurance, right? It's not a very fancy topic, but I have some background in insurance, and it's something that's interesting to me at least. So if we imagine a world where there's a lot of data being collected, right? And to some extent, we are living in a mini version of that world right now. We have transponders, we have units that can be installed in cars that can collect data about your driving habits and your driving patterns. If we assume that there's a lot more data than that, then insurance companies can start to hyper-segment and classify risk based on individual to a lot more granular degree because they have a lot more data to feed into those models of risk. Now, the problem is if you take that to the extreme and you have a segment of one for insurance, then you've gotten rid of the premise of insurance, because the premise of insurance is to pool risk, right? So it doesn't seem fair anymore that you're no longer pooling that risk.
Okay, here's the thing. So it depends on what we are trying to insure, right? Like if you're talking about car insurance, home insurance, life insurance, I don't think you can do that. Like the government is not going to let you do that. Well, you never know.
You never know. It depends on which government.
Then it is like no insurance at all. Like the concept of insurance doesn't exist at all.
Right, because you're just saving at that point. It's not insurance. You're not really pooling risk. You're just saving for your own risk.
Exactly. Insurance is what? Like you are paying the probability times whatever the cost of the damage that particular event is going to happen. You're just paying it as premium. So if the insurance company is going to put a bigger probability of risk on you, either they make you pay higher premiums or they don't insure you at all.
Right.
Then, like you said, they're just going to say up for it. Right.
Yeah. And it just equals saving up for it. There's no difference. So let me put a sharper point on this. So let's think about idiosyncratic versus systemic risk. So just by virtue of the fact that I get into a car,
Yep.
it introduces systemic risk, right? Because by getting into a car and by going onto the road, there are, in the nature of traffic, there are other cars on the road that they could plow into me. No matter how well I drive, I have no control over those conditions. And then this idiosyncratic risk comes where, how good of a driver am I, right? Do I introduce additional risk as I drive? Now, auto insurance might not be as interesting, but let's think about.
But regardless of what insurance, they're going to take in both systemic and idiosyncratic risk.
I think the issue is that right now they don't have as granular insight into the idiosyncratic risk.
Yeah.
And so if we think about like health insurance, for example, health insurance is a good example because it's hard for us to draw the line a lot of times between what is idiosyncratic risk and what is systemic risk. Now, let me give you an example, a very specific example. If you have a certain genetic mutation that results in a disease like Lou Gehrig's or Crohn's or whatever, is that idiosyncratic risk or is that systemic risk?
It'll be an idiosyncratic risk.
But you, as an individual, have done nothing to introduce risk.
Well, that's not idiosyncratic. It's just you specific, right? The systemic is everything that's around you.
Right. So this challenges the model of idiosyncratic versus systemic risk, because people have no control over their genetics, right? So that challenges, because our concept of fairness is that if you as an individual have introduced risk, yeah, sure, you should pay more, right? But my genes have introduced risk, right? I haven't willingly done so. My genes have done so. So how is it fair that I am now paying for the additional idiosyncratic risk that I actually did not introduce?
But why would this be a problem in a single payer economy or single payer health system?
I don't think it would. But I think when we're talking about like using insurance companies using big data to hyper segment individuals, if I am hyper segmented, then I would pay higher premiums than everyone else, right? Versus in a single payer system, like in Canada's system, I'm paying not based on my risk, but it's based on my income, right? Which means the governments in Canada have decided that we don't care about idiosyncratic risk, really.
It's just a systematic
risk.
It's
just, we're going to treat everything as if it was systematic risk. So, but there are private insurance companies in the US and even the non-government insured parts of the healthcare system in Canada that could be priced based on idiosyncratic risk. Now, would it be fair for these companies to price to hyper segment individuals? Would it be fair for these companies to hyper segment individuals and then require them to pay more simply because their genes have introduced new risk? And if you were lucky enough to have, quote unquote, good genes, right, and it doesn't introduce new risk, then you've won the healthcare lottery, right?
Yeah, but I still think that's, at least in the healthcare space, that's very unlikely to happen. Like, right? I would assume like there will be laws around it for to prevent this insurance companies to do stuff like that, wouldn't they?
Depends where and depends on what government.
Yeah, anything's possible these days.
Right. So I think like there's specifically in the realm of insurance, I think there's a lot of questions to be asked around how big data can be used to segment individuals and to evaluate the nature of risk that they present to the insurer. And again, to your point, these questions should drive discussions around policy, around regulation of insurance products, such that we can have a good sense, or so that the insurance companies actually provide products and provide pricing in a way that reflects society's views on fairness. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our first week. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of big data, privacy, and ethics. Next week, we'll be talking about automation and impacts to society. It's a lens to, obviously, philosophy and technology as we move forward.
Are we doing self-driving cars?
We're doing self-driving cars.
Yeah.
We're doing automation of jobs and any other topics that we might think of on that day.
Sweet.
Cool. Thanks.